Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The wind whispered through the towering oaks of an ancient forest, their gnarled roots twisting beneath a thick veil of mist that curled and stretched like ghostly fingers over the damp earth. There was a feeling here, something deeper than the rustling leaves or the distant hoot of an owl, a presence that defied time, a power woven into the very fabric of the land. This was no ordinary forest. This was a place where stories were born, where the past and the future coiled together in unseen patterns. And at the heart of it all stood a figure, cloaked in the very essence of mystery. His name was Merlin. To most, he was merely a legend, a whisper of magic carried on the tongues of bards and dreamers, the wise old wizard who had shaped the fate of King Arthur and the great kingdom of Camelot. But his story was far older, far stranger than most would ever know. He was not merely a mentor with a pointed hat or a gentle enchanter at a king's side. He was a prophet and a trickster, a force of nature and a shadow on the edge of history. Some believed he had been born of something beyond human, that his blood carried the echoes of a world unseen. Others swore he knew too much, that his eyes had peered too far into the unwritten days and seen burdens no man should carry. Legends spoke of him as a druid, a madman, a sorcerer who had danced between the lines of fate with a knowing smile. He had shaped the rise of kings and walked unseen among the powerful, only to vanish into the folds of myth. But where did he truly come from? And how had the greatest magician Britain had ever known met a fate that even he, with all his wisdom, could not escape? His origins were as elusive as the mist that shrouded the forests he wandered. Unlike Arthur or Lancelot, whose tales were set in stone, Merlin's legend twisted and changed over time, a story without a single beginning. In the oldest of whispers, he was not a court magician, nor a wise and noble advisor, but something wilder, a man lost to civilization, a prophet who had retreated into the deep woods, where the trees knew his name. In ancient Welsh poetry, he was known as Myrddin Wyllt, Merlin the Wild, a bard who had once stood beside a great warlord in the battles of a crumbling age. They said he had fought in a war that drowned the land in blood, and when his lord had fallen, grief had shattered his mind. He fled into the endless forest, his voice no longer speaking the words of men, but the riddles of fate. For years he wandered, living as a hermit, whispering secrets to the winds and listening to the voices carried in the rustling leaves. He spoke of battles yet to come, of kings who had not yet been born, of a land that would one day tremble under the weight of destiny. Those who stumbled upon him feared him, for he was no longer a man bound by the rules of the world, but something untamed, a creature of the wilderness itself. The people called him mad, but they also listened, for his words held truths they could not ignore. And so he remained, a shadow in the woods, a prophet speaking to the earth, feared and revered in equal measure. His legend might have remained there, confined to the whispers of the wild places, had it not been for a man who would take his story and change it forever. In the 12th century, a cleric and historian named Geoffrey of Monmouth wove together the scattered fragments of Merlin's tale and gave him new life. He penned a book, a sweeping account of Britain's history, half truth, half invention, but entirely captivating. And within those pages, Merlin was reborn. No longer was he a wild man, a lost prophet in the trees. Geoffrey crafted him into something greater, a sorcerer of unparalleled power, a master of prophecy, and a kingmaker who would shape the fate of Britain itself. He took the old tales of Méadin Wild and stitched them together with Roman and Christian influences, molding Merlin into the son of a mortal woman and a supernatural force, an incubus, a being of shadow and magic. This transformation made Merlin something unique, something neither wholly man nor entirely otherworldly. Unlike Arthur, whose fate was forged by the hands of men, Merlin existed beyond mortal constraints. He belonged to no kingdom, no throne, and yet his hand guided them all. It was Geoffrey's version of Merlin that laid the foundation for the wizard's legend as we know it today. From that moment forward, Merlin would be no mere wild prophet, no mad bard lost to the woods. He would be the architect of Britain's greatest king. Merlin was no longer a nameless figure lost to the wilderness. He was now the unseen force shaping the destiny of kings, the master of magic, whose knowledge stretched beyond the grasp of mortal minds. But for all his wisdom, he remained an enigma, shifting through time like mist through the trees, his form and purpose ever-changing. Artists and poets who sought to capture his essence could not agree on his image. Some still saw him as the wild druid of old, his hair unkempt, his robes little more than the tattered remnants of a life abandoned to the forests. He spoke in riddles, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, and those who met him left with more questions than answers. Others reimagined him as something else entirely, a scholar cloaked in celestial robes, symbols of arcane knowledge woven into the fabric of his garments. This Merlin did not wander the woods, but studied in secret towers and hidden sanctuaries, his hands forever turning the pages of books filled with knowledge long forgotten. It was this version of Merlin that would inspire the wizards of later tales, the wise old mage with a flowing beard, his piercing eyes holding the secrets of the universe. His very image became a blueprint for magic itself, an idea so powerful that echoes of it could be found in stories centuries later. Yet, for all the ways Merlin had changed, one truth remained. He did not belong to the world of men. He did not seek power, nor did he crave a throne. He moved through history as an unseen hand, setting events into motion, ensuring that Arthur, the once and future king, would rise when the time was right. But before Arthur could rule, before Camelot could stand, Merlin had to shape the path that would bring him into the world. And for that, he would need to bend fate itself. Other Pendragon was a king, but his reign was one of strife. His enemies gathered like wolves, the Saxons pressing from the east, rival lords plotting in the shadows. But none of these threats consumed him as much as his desire for one woman, Igraine, the wife of Duke Gorlois of Cornwall. Others' obsession was his undoing, his longing for Igraine blinding him to all else. Gorlois, wary of the king's intentions, took his wife to Tintagel, a fortress carved into the cliffs, so well protected that no army could breach its walls. But Other was not a man to accept denial. Desperation drove him to Merlin, offering anything in exchange for a way to claim Igraine as his own. Merlin, who had seen what would come, who knew that the union of Other and Igraine would bring forth the future king, agreed, but at a price. He would grant Other his desire, but in return, the child born of their union would belong to him. Other, consumed by longing, did not hesitate. And so, Merlin worked his magic. With illusions spun from the very fabric of the night, he transformed Other's form, molding him into the image of Gorlois himself. Under this guise, the king slipped past the impenetrable walls of Tintagel, and that night, Arthur was conceived. But even as Other took what he wanted, the true Gorlois lay dying on the battlefield, cut down by Other's men. When Igraine learned of her husband's death and of the deception that had been wrought upon her, she had no choice but to wed Other. Camelot's fate had been sealed, yet Merlin's work was far from done. He had no intention of leaving Arthur in the hands of a king who had already proven himself reckless, who had been willing to forsake everything for his own desires. When the child was born, Merlin came to collect his price. Other, despite his sorrow, honored the bargain. And so the infant Arthur was spirited away, placed in the care of Sir Ector, a noble knight of no great standing, who would raise the boy as his own. It was Merlin's greatest trick, not a spell of illusion or a whisper of prophecy, but a simple act that would change everything. He had removed Arthur from the reach of power, hidden him from the corrupting influence of court life, and in doing so, allowed him to grow into the king Britain needed. For years, Arthur lived as the son of a humble knight, never knowing the truth of his lineage. But destiny does not wait forever. As Other's reign crumbled, the kingdom fell into chaos. The throne stood empty, warlords and noblemen vying for power, each claiming the right to rule. And then, one day, a sword appeared, a blade buried in stone, an inscription etched into the metal that held the answer to Britain's future. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone is the rightful king of Britain. The greatest knights and lords came forth, each convinced they were chosen, but none could free the sword from its prison. The people despaired, believing the land to be cursed, the rightful king lost. But fate had already chosen. Arthur, still a boy, still unaware of his true place in the world, had come to the tournament in London as a simple squire to his foster brother, Sir Kay. When Kay misplaced his sword, Arthur, eager to help, searched for a replacement. His eyes fell upon the blade embedded in stone. He did not see it as a test, as a prophecy fulfilled. It was simply a sword, waiting to be taken. With little effort, Arthur pulled the blade free. The world changed in an instant. Merlin had set the final piece in place. The boy who had been raised in secret, who had known nothing of kingship or power, was now the chosen ruler of Britain. But Arthur's journey had only just begun, and Merlin knew that even the brightest stars eventually flickered and fell. The future was set. The kingdom would rise, and one day it would fall. The sword had been drawn, and with it, Arthur's fate was sealed. Yet even as the lords and knights of Britain stared in disbelief, even as whispers of prophecy turned to shouts of protest, Arthur himself remained unaware of the weight now resting upon his shoulders. He had not pulled the sword to claim a throne. He had not sought power. He had simply done what needed to be done. But destiny does not ask for permission. It only moves forward, unrelenting. Merlin watched from the shadows, knowing that Arthur's trials were far from over. The boy would not be accepted easily. Many of the great lords refused to believe that a nameless squire, raised outside of nobility, could be their king. The sword in his hands was not enough. They demanded proof. And so Arthur was tested. Again and again, he was asked to withdraw the sword. And each time, the blade slid free with effortless grace. Yet still, doubt lingered. The nobles who had dreamed of ruling Britain could not accept a boy of unknown birth. Some plotted rebellion. Others sought to manipulate him, hoping to bend the young king to their will. But Arthur was not alone. Sir Ector, the only father he had ever known, stood by him. Sir Kay, his foster brother, too proud at first, soon understood the truth and pledged his loyalty. And above all, there was Merlin, the unseen architect of Arthur's rise, the guiding hand that had shaped his path long before he ever knew his own name. Yet Merlin was not simply a mentor. He was a force of fate itself, ensuring that Arthur did not merely wear a crown, but became the king he was meant to be. In the years that followed, Merlin whispered knowledge into Arthur's ears, taught him the ways of ruling, of battle, of wisdom that stretched beyond mortal understanding. It was Merlin who led Arthur to Excalibur, the blade destined for a true king, gifted by the Lady of the Lake, a sword of legend, one that would cut through the lies of men and forge the kingdom to come. With Excalibur in his grasp, Arthur stood not as a boy, not as an uncertain heir, but as a ruler. He gathered knights of unmatched valor, warriors bound not by blood, but by honor. Camelot was born not as a city of stone and towers, but as an idea, a beacon of justice and chivalry in a land long torn by war. And at the heart of it all, Merlin remained, watching, guiding, ensuring that the kingdom did not stray from its course. But even as Camelot flourished, shadows lingered at its edges. Merlin had seen it all before. He knew that greatness was never without its end. The future whispered to him in visions of blood and betrayal, in the echoes of a battle that had not yet come. And yet, for all his knowledge, he did not stop it. Perhaps he could not. Arthur, for all his strength, for all his nobility, was still only a man. And men are fragile things, bound by love, by pride, by the weight of choices that can never be undone. Merlin had ensured that Arthur became king, but he could not shield him from the burdens of ruling. He could not keep him from the hands of fate. And so, as the days of Camelot turned to legend, as the knights of the Round Table swore their oaths beneath banners of gold and crimson, Merlin remained in the shadows, waiting for the moment he had seen so long ago, the moment when the dream would begin to crumble, when the kingdom he had built would turn to ruin. For a time, Camelot stood untouchable, its glory stretching across the land like the dawn after a long night. Arthur, guided by Merlin's wisdom, ruled with justice, and the Round Table became a symbol of unity, where knights swore not to serve their own desires, but the ideals of honor and chivalry. Under Arthur's reign, the kingdom flourished. Enemies who once sought to divide Britain now bent the knee, and for the first time in generations, the land knew peace. But peace is never eternal. The cracks were already forming, small at first, like the whisper of a storm before the thunder. And Merlin, with all his knowledge, all his foresight, saw them long before anyone else. He had glimpsed the betrayals before they ever took root, had seen the faces of those who would bring about the fall of Camelot. He had known from the beginning that Arthur's greatest battles would not be fought on the fields of war, but within the walls of his own kingdom. And yet, Merlin did not intervene. Not because he lacked the power, but because he understood something that Arthur never could. Some fates are written in stone. Some destinies, no matter how painful, cannot be changed. Among the shadows that threatened Camelot, none loomed greater than Mordred. The boy was Arthur's son, though not born of love, nor even of a union that should have been possible. tale was twisted and dark, a cruel trick played by fate. Morgause, Arthur's half-sister, had deceived him, ensnaring him in a web of magic and desire, leading to a night neither of them should have shared. From that night, Mordred was born, a child destined to be the downfall of the very man who had given him life. Merlin had known of Mordred's fate before the boy had even drawn breath. He had seen him standing on the battlefield, a blade of ruin in his hand, his father's blood staining the earth beneath him. He had seen Camelot burning, its towers crumbling, its people scattering like autumn leaves in the wind. He had seen the end, and yet he did nothing. He could not. Arthur, unaware of the full truth, unknowingly allowed Mordred to grow within the very walls of his kingdom. The boy was raised as a knight, trained in the ways of battle, his heart filled with ambitions that burned brighter than the oaths he swore. There was a darkness in him, one that even Merlin could not banish, for it was written in the stars, as surely as Arthur's rise had been. But Mordred was not the only shadow. Another threat festered within Camelot's walls, one that struck at Arthur's heart in a different way. Guinevere, the queen Arthur loved beyond reason, and Lancelot, the greatest of his knights, were bound by something neither of them could control. Love, in its cruelest form. Their affair was whispered about in hushed voices, hidden behind stolen glances and lingering touches. Arthur did not see it, for he trusted too deeply, believed too wholly in those he held dear. But Merlin saw. He had warned Arthur once, long ago, that even the brightest of kings could be undone not by the swords of their enemies, but by the betrayals of those closest to them. And yet, Arthur had refused to believe it. He had built Camelot on faith in his knights, in his queen, in the ideals he had sworn to uphold. But faith, like a kingdom, can crumble. The day would come when the whispers turned to shouts, when the hidden love of Lancelot and Guinevere would no longer remain in the dark. And when that day arrived, it would not simply break Arthur's heart, it would break Camelot itself. The dream, the golden kingdom, the peace that had been so carefully built, would begin to shatter. Merlin watched it all unfold, unable to stop the unraveling of the fate he had foreseen. For years, he had been Arthur's guide, his protector, the one who had ensured his rise to power. But he was never meant to stand beside him forever. His time in the mortal world was drawing to an end, and the one who would bring about his fall was already waiting in the wings, watching with a smile that held more power than any spell he had ever cast. The end of Merlin's time in Camelot did not come with war, nor with fire or steel, but with something far more dangerous, love. Not the noble love of Arthur for his queen, nor the forbidden love that bound Lancelot and Guinevere, but a love that crept in like a slow, creeping poison, a love Merlin himself had not foreseen. It was the love that would be his undoing. Her name was Vivienne, the Lady of the Lake, a woman of enchantment and mystery. She was no ordinary mortal, no queen of men, but a being of magic, woven from the very forces Merlin had spent his life mastering. Some said she was the guardian of the waters, the one who had gifted Arthur his legendary sword, Excalibur. Others whispered that she was something older, something beyond even Merlin's understanding. But whatever she was, one thing was certain. She was the only person who had ever truly ensnared the great wizard's heart. Merlin had taught many things to many men, but Vivienne was different. She was not a student, not a mere apprentice looking to grasp at power beyond her reach. She was his equal in ways he had never expected. And so, slowly, over years of trust and whispered secrets, he taught her everything. Every spell, every enchantment, every hidden knowledge that only he possessed, he gave to her freely, willingly. Perhaps he believed that she would carry his wisdom forward after he was gone. Perhaps he simply wished to share the burden of his knowledge with someone who understood. But love, even for a wizard, is a dangerous thing. Vivienne did not seek power in the way others did. She did not crave a throne, nor command armies, nor wish to shape the fate of men. And yet, she understood something Merlin never had. Knowledge is its own kind of prison. The more one knows, the heavier the weight becomes. She saw in Merlin a man burdened by the weight of futures he could not change, a man doomed to watch the fall of everything he had built. And she made a choice. One night, beneath the glow of a silver moon, Vivienne used the very magic Merlin had taught her to bind him. The spell was not one of destruction, nor of death, but something far crueler. She imprisoned him, trapping him within a timeless slumber, sealing him away in a place where neither time nor fate could reach him. Some say he sleeps beneath the roots of an ancient oak, his body entwined with the earth itself. Others claim he is hidden beneath a lake, his breath forever mingling with the water that once reflected the stars he had read so well. Wherever he rests, one truth remains: Merlin, the greatest wizard Britain had ever known, was gone. And with him, so too would Camelot fall. Arthur did not know of Merlin's fate until it was too late. He called for his old friend, sought his guidance as the shadows closed in around him. But no answer came. For the first time, Arthur stood alone. The betrayals Merlin had foreseen were now upon them. The whispers of Lancelot and Guinevere had turned to accusations. Mordred, the son Arthur never wished to claim, had risen against him. The kingdom that had once stood unshaken now trembled on the edge of ruin. Had Merlin still been at Arthur's side, perhaps things might have been different. Perhaps he could have mended what had been broken, woven new threads into the fabric of fate. But fate had already made its choice. And Arthur, like Merlin before him, was marching toward an end he could not escape. Camelot had been built on ideals, honor, loyalty, justice. But ideals are fragile things, and in the end, they shattered under the weight of human weakness. The kingdom that had once been the beacon of Arthur's dreams now stood divided. The love of Lancelot and Guinevere had been revealed, not in whispers, but in open scandal. Betrayal had seeped into the very heart of the Round Table, and the knights who had once sworn undying loyalty now turned against each other, their brotherhood fractured beyond repair. Arthur, torn between duty and his own aching heart, had no choice but to act. He could not ignore the law, nor could he turn a blind eye to the betrayal of his queen. Guinevere was sentenced to death, her execution set before the eyes of all Camelot. But Lancelot, bound by love stronger than any oath, would not let her die. In the dead of night, he stormed the execution grounds, his sword cutting through those who dared to stand between him and the woman he could not bear to lose. The battle was brief, bloody, and by the time the sun rose over Camelot, Lancelot was gone, Guinevere with him. The betrayal was complete, and Arthur, broken but bound by his duty, could not forgive. The knights who had once sat together in unity now raised their blades against one another. Arthur led his army to pursue Lancelot, and in doing so, he left his kingdom vulnerable. He had never seen the true danger, the storm waiting just beyond the horizon. For while Arthur chased the ghost of lost love, Mordred was waiting. The boy Arthur had never claimed as his own had grown into a man filled with resentment, a man who saw not a king, but a man unworthy of the throne he held. And as Arthur rode away from Camelot, Mordred seized the moment. He took the throne, declaring himself the rightful ruler of Britain. Those who had grown disillusioned with Arthur, those who had watched their kingdom crumble under the weight of betrayal, turned to Mordred, swearing fealty to a new king. By the time Arthur learned of the treachery, it was too late. He had no kingdom to return to, only a battlefield where father and son would meet for the first and last time. Merlin, had he still walked among men, might have warned Arthur of what was to come. He might have whispered words of caution, might have altered fate as he had done so many times before. But Merlin was gone, locked away in a prison of enchantment, his voice lost to the winds. And so, Arthur rode into battle blind to what awaited him. The fields of Camlan were soaked in mist on the morning of the final battle. Two armies stood across from one another, Arthur's remaining loyal knights, those who still clung to the dream of Camelot, and Mordred's forces, men who saw Arthur not as a king, but as a relic of a past that had already crumbled. There was no diplomacy, no attempt at peace. Only steel, only blood. Arthur fought as he always had, his sword striking true, his warriors pushing forward with the force of desperation. Excalibur cut through the enemy like a blade through mist. and for a moment, it seemed as if Arthur might triumph, as if he might reclaim what had been lost. But fate is not so easily denied. Amidst the chaos, Arthur and Mordred met at last, not as father and son, but as enemies. Their swords clashed, ringing like thunder over the battlefield. Mordred fought not with skill, but with fury, and Arthur, weary from years of war, struggled against the weight of destiny pressing down upon him. And then, in a single moment, it was done. Arthur's blade found its mark, piercing through Mordred's armor, striking deep. The young knight gasped, his strength failing him. But even in his final breath, he would not be denied his vengeance. With the last of his strength, he drove his own sword forward, and the tip of the blade found Arthur's flesh. Father and son fell together. Camelot was no more. The battlefield was silent, save for the distant cries of the dying. The clash of swords had faded, the banners of Camelot torn and trampled into the blood-soaked earth. Arthur lay still, his breath shallow, Excalibur slipping from his grasp. Around him, his knights had either fallen or fled, and the dream he had built, the kingdom he had fought for, was now nothing more than a ruin of broken oaths and shattered ideals. Mordred lay lifeless beside him, his vengeance fulfilled at the cost of his own life. The war was over, but there was no victor, only the whispers of the wind through the dead. Arthur knew his end was near. The wound Mordred had given him was deep, a mortal wound, one even the greatest of healers could not mend. He had known that this day would come, though he had never imagined it would end like this, on a battlefield soaked in the blood of those he had once called his own. He did not fear death, but he grieved for what had been lost for Camelot, for the round table, for the dream that had burned so brightly and faded so quickly. As his vision blurred, footsteps approached. A lone knight knelt beside him, a familiar presence in the fatting world. It was Sir Bedivere, the last of his most loyal warriors, the only one who had not abandoned him. Arthur, with what little strength remained, reached for his sword. "Take Excalibur," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. "Take it to the lake. Return it to the lady. It was never mine to keep." Bedivere hesitated. The sword was more than just steel, it was legend, a weapon of kings, a blade that had shaped the fate of Britain itself. But Arthur's gaze, though weak, was unyielding. The knight obeyed. He carried the sword to the shore of a still, dark lake, its waters untouched by the battle that had raged beyond. The moment he stepped to the edge, the wind seemed to whisper around him, as if the world itself was waiting. Summoning all his will, he cast Excalibur into the depths. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, from beneath the water, a hand rose, pale and slender, catching the sword before it could sink. The Lady of the Lake had come to claim what was hers. slow, graceful movement, the hand drew the blade beneath the surface, and Excalibur was gone. When Bedivere returned, Arthur's eyes were already closing. The world around him was fading, the weight of his body growing light. But as he lay there, on the brink of death, a strange peace settled over him. Some say that Arthur died that day, that the once and future king was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, his kingdom lost to time. But others tell a different tale, that as the last light left his eyes, the mists of Avalon rose from the earth, wrapping around him like a shroud, carrying him away to a place beyond the reach of men. The mist thickened, swirling like a veil between the world of men and the realm beyond. The battlefield, the cries of the fallen, even the weight of Arthur's dying breath, all of it faded into silence. The knights who remained swore they saw a boat emerge from the mist, its black wood gliding soundlessly across the water. Figures stood upon it, robed in white, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of ages long forgotten. And at the center of them lay Arthur, his body cradled in their arms as they carried him away, beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of time. They say he was taken to Avalon, the hidden isle where the wounded do not die, where kings sleep until the world calls them once more. There, beneath a sky untouched by war, Arthur would rest, neither truly dead nor truly among the living. It was said that one day, when Britain stood upon the edge of ruin, when darkness threatened to consume the land once more, he would rise again. The once and future king, returning when his people needed him most. But if Arthur had been carried away by fate, Merlin remained lost to it. The great wizard who had shaped Britain's destiny, who had whispered prophecy into the ears of kings, now lay bound in a prison of enchantment, his voice silenced, his magic locked away. Whether he still breathed, whether he still dreamed of the world he had built, no one knew. Some believed he was trapped within the hollow of an ancient tree, his body entwined with the roots of the forest he had once called home. Others swore he was beneath the waters, resting in the depths of a hidden lake, waiting, watching. Yet even in his absence, his influence remained. His spells still lingered in the air, woven into the very land itself. His visions, though unspoken, still shaped the echoes of the future. And in the hearts of those who still whispered his name, the legend of Merlin lived on. Camelot had fallen. The round table was no more. The golden age of Arthur's rule had faded into myth. But legends do not die. They simply sleep, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to believe again. And so, somewhere beyond the veil of time, in a place where mist meets the edge of the world, two figures rest, one a king, waiting for the call of his people, the other a wizard, waiting for the day his voice will once again shape destiny. For in the end, neither Arthur nor Merlin truly vanished. They simply became legend. The end